Okay, and my friends, tonight we are joined by Kristin Brunk, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And from 2017 to 2019, she worked alongside California State Parks, collecting data to evaluate the effectiveness of our Crumb Clean campaign. And tonight she's going to chat with us about her findings, the outcomes of that evaluation, and I think chat with us also a little bit about general marbled murrelet conservation and life history and things like that. So if you could please join me in welcoming Kristin Brunk. Kristin, whenever you are ready.
Awesome. I think I just shared my screen. Hopefully, can y'all see this?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Okay, nailed it. Yeah, so thank you so much, Dylan. I'm really psyched to be here. Like Dylan said, my name is Kristin. I spent 3 summers out at Big Basin studying Steller's jays and marbled murrelets, mostly Steller's jays, honestly, spoiler alert. But yeah, it's been fantastic, and I'm really excited to share some of the results from that work with you all tonight. And before I get too far in, I just wanted to acknowledge how many people helped out with this project and made this project happen. It would not have been possible without my co-authors and advisors, obviously Dr. Elena West, Dr. Zach Peary, and Dr. Anna Pigeon, but also maybe more importantly, the Big Basin staff and rangers. I don't know if you all connect with them a lot, but Portia Halbert and then Alex Taboni were my main points of contact when I was working out at the park, and they basically made all the magic happen. So huge kudos to them. I also have a small army of undergraduate lab technicians who processed the hundreds of samples that I would bring back every summer at the end of the summer after collecting them. And so those people are the true heroes here. And then I was also really lucky to work with 4 incredible field technicians, Holly, Jessica, Gabby, and Lake, over the 3 summers that I was out there. And so, yeah, it takes a village to make a project like this happen. And then also some really generous funding sources, including California State Parks and Save the Redwoods League. So yeah, thanks to everyone for making this research happen. I think evaluating these kinds of conservation efforts is so important and something that we so often aren't able to do. So yeah. With that, I will jump into the actual bird part of tonight's event. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about marbled murrelets to begin. And so as a lot of you probably are going to already know a lot of this talk is a little bit geared toward my normal Midwestern audience that has no idea what a marbled murrelet is or why it matters. So hopefully you'll pick up a little bit something new tonight as I talk about murrelets, but if not, at least there's pretty pictures. So the murrelet belongs to the alcid family, which is the same family that includes kind of the charismatic megafauna like puffins and guillemots and razorbills. And alcids are often compared to penguins. They're kind of the penguins of the Northern Hemisphere because both groups are wing-propelled divers rather than being foot-propelled like something like a cormorant. And murrelets themselves, I don't know how many of you have seen them before. Maybe some of you have been lucky enough. They're small and really chunky seabirds. They're only about the size of a robin. And this bird on the top left here is in its breeding plumage, so that nice brown mottled or marbled color, if you will. And then the bird on the bottom is in its wintering plumage. And so that's the much more classic counter shading that we usually see on seabirds. And that counter shading really helps them blend in when they're sitting on top of the water like that bird is doing there. And murrelets range from the Aleutian Islands up in Alaska all the way down to Central California. And tonight I'm going to really be focusing on this kind of southern portion of their range where I did most of my work, and also where y'all are located too. So this works out really well. I think that marbled murrelets have the coolest life history of any seabird, and I might be slightly biased since I've been studying them for the last 5 years of my life, but they're pretty cool. So like most other seabirds, they spend a lot of their life at sea foraging. Sorry, my cat is climbing in front of the microphone. Yeah, so like most seabirds, they spend a lot of their life at sea. They eat small fish like sand lances and things like squid. But if you think about where a normal seabird nests, you usually think about rocky coastlines or islands, or usually large colonies of birds that are clustered really tightly together. But that's not at all what the marbled murrelet is about. They actually nest up to 50 miles inland, up in high branches of really old trees. So usually things like coast redwoods, or even more frequently in Douglas firs. And these trees are usually over 200 years old. And y'all work in the redwoods, so I don't have to tell you. This is usually the part where I wax poetic about how amazing redwood forests are. But you all, I'm sure, have seen them and been to them. And so murrelets basically make their living by not being seen. They camouflage really well into trees due to that brown cryptic coloration. And so usually if we know that they're there, it's because we've heard them. And so I kind of wanted to have you all just close your eyes and put yourself in the redwoods and imagine that if there's a marbled murrelet around, it would sound something like this. And then it just devolves into a little murrelet party. But yeah, pretty magical sound. And so murrelets don't really construct a nest. They basically just kind of drop their egg in an indentation in the moss on wide branches. And so that's why it's so important that the trees that they nest in are so old, so that those branches can get wide enough that their egg doesn't just roll off as soon as they lay it. And you all probably already know this too, but murrelets are so sneaky and so cryptic when they're on the nest that we didn't actually find the first nest in North America until 1974. And I think Audubon had put out an actual bounty for the first person who could figure out where murrelets nested, because we knew these birds existed. We saw them at sea, but we had no idea where they nested. And so yeah, in 1974, a tree trimmer found the first nest at Big Basin. And I'm going to be talking a lot about Big Basin in this presentation. But I have also been hiking at Henry Cowell Redwood, so I'm still relevant for you all at Henry Cowell as well. But yeah, so marbled murrelets lay one egg per year, but they lay a really huge egg. This blows my mind every time I talk about it. So murrelets lay an egg that weighs a similar amount to a chicken egg, even though, like I said, a murrelet is only the size of a robin. So there's a ton of energy being invested into this one egg. And just for another comparison that I think is mind-blowing, in humans, a full-term baby usually weighs about 5% of the mother when it's born. A murrelet egg weighs 16 to 19% of an adult murrelet. So if you just think about the amount of energy that's going into that one egg that's laid per year, it's kind of incredible. And male and female murrelets, the adults will trade off incubation in 24-hour shifts. So usually one will be out at sea foraging. It'll fly in usually before sunrise, and it'll switch with the bird that's on the nest. That one will fly out to sea and forage for 24 hours before returning the next day. And so remember, that's a 50-mile trip that they're making every single day. And then fast forward, they do those 24-hour shifts for 28 to 30 days. That's how long it takes for that big old egg to hatch. And then when it does hatch, it looks a little something like this, pretty cute, pretty cryptic. Again, it blends in really well into that old growth forest habitat. After the egg hatches, the parents actually only brood the chick for 1 or 2 days until it can thermoregulate, which means keep itself warm and keep itself cool if necessary. And then after those 2 days, both of the parents fly out to the ocean. And at that point, they're basically making trips out to sea and back to feed the chick as frequently as they can. So remember, again, a potentially 50-mile trip, one direction. And they're usually feeding the chick between 1 and 8 times per day. So it's a ton of energy that the parents are investing in this one little offspring each year. And so the adults will do that for 27 to 40 days-ish. And then I think the most incredible part of this, and we still don't even know how they do it, is that at that point, the parents stop coming back. They stop feeding the chick. And that's when the chick decides, well, I guess it's time to go to the ocean. So it jumps out of its 200-foot tall tree and flies to the ocean, which it has never seen before. And at that point, it's basically completely independent of its parents. The chicks will sometimes hang out in small groups together, but they are not fed by their parents at that point. So pretty much after that, they're independent. So this is a really long, slow life history. In ecology, we call this a K-selected species. So they usually live a really long time. So adults will really commonly live over 10 years, and sometimes they even live over 20 years. But this kind of dual life history means that they're reliant on both inland habitat, so old growth forests for nesting, as well as marine habitat at sea. And unfortunately, that also means that they're susceptible to threats in both of those habitats. So at sea, they're really threatened by direct mortality from things like being caught in gill nets or being caught in oil spills as well. And then there's a lot of indirect factors like climate change, which can affect the frequency of El Nino ocean warming events, which generally are bad for most species of seabirds because it can really mess with the prey availability. When the cool water doesn't do the upwelling, all the nutrients are really deep in the water. And so the fish aren't coming up to the surface to get those nutrients. And so there's not very much food available at depths where seabirds can dive to. On land, there's kind of a whole other suite of threats. The one that you've probably heard a ton about is historic loss of nesting habitat. And this is largely due to logging of old growth forests, which, as you know, old growth forest trees are extremely economically valuable to people as well. And so in California, again, where a lot of my work has taken place, murrelets have lost at least 85% of the old growth forest in those areas. And full disclosure, I got this map from my advisor, so it's also probably really old and not updated. So I'm guessing that those current old growth areas have probably shrunk a little bit since then. But luckily, most of the remaining murrelet habitat in California, at least, is in protected areas. So it's this historic logging that's created these legacy effects that we're still seeing today. But the main factor that's impacting murrelets still and causing continuing declines, we think, is low reproductive success. And that's largely due to really high rates of nest failure because of predation of murrelet eggs and nestlings. And so that's the threat that I'm going to kind of talk about a lot tonight. But altogether, these threats have contributed to really long-term population declines across the entire range of the marbled murrelet. So that range from the Aleutians all the way to Central California, we think they're declining at a rate of about 4 to 7% per year, which doesn't sound like a lot, but actually adds up really quickly. And even in Alaska, where there numerically are a lot more murrelets, populations have declined by as much as 50 to 73% over the last 20 years, which is kind of alarming. And so in 1992, kind of in response to all of these threats, the marbled murrelet was listed as threatened in Washington, Oregon, and California under the Federal Endangered Species Act. And actually in August, the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Commission voted to reclassify the murrelet from state threatened to state endangered. And murrelets are also listed as state endangered in California and Washington. And so there's a lot of folks that are working on a lot of these different threats to murrelets at sea and on land. But my work and the work that I'm going to talk about today focuses, like I said, a lot on these threats on land and specifically on this threat of low reproductive success. So a lot of the remaining murrelet habitat is in protected areas, like I said, and it's great that this habitat is protected. But these areas are also of really high value to humans for outdoor recreation. And where human recreation and wildlife conservation coincide, there can sometimes be these unintended consequences. We're really just beginning to understand all of the impacts that human recreation has on wildlife in protected areas. And the one I'm going to talk about today involves human food subsidies, or when wildlife eats human food. Areas that have a lot of anthropogenic foods or human foods generally have really high densities of species that can take advantage of that resource. In particular, I'm talking about omnivores that can eat a really wide variety of foods. So if you think about things like coyotes and raccoons and squirrels and bears, we usually call these animals in ecology generalists. And these elevated densities of generalists can modify interspecies interactions, so interactions between different species. So things like competition and predation, and in some cases it can lead to what we call spillover predation, which, like this definition says, is basically when really plentiful food resources in one habitat allow predators to achieve these really high densities and then spread into other habitats where they can prey upon rare species. And in some cases, when this gets really intense, we actually call it hyperpredation, which I think just sounds alarming. And so at the very southernmost point of the Marbled Murrelets range, as a lot of you probably know, the largest remaining tract of old growth forest is protected at Big Basin Redwood State Park. I'm sure many of you have been there. It's the oldest state park in California, and it receives over 100,000 visitors per year just to its campgrounds, not even counting like day use hikers. And so when we go camping, or maybe just when I go camping, I don't know, I love snacks. People usually bring a lot of food with them. And there's one generalist predator in particular that's really capitalized on all of these abundant human food subsidies that sometimes look a little bit like this. And that predator is the Steller's jay. And so some previous work at Big Basin showed that over half of Steller's jay diets in campgrounds were composed of human foods. And further, that jays that lived in campgrounds and were eating lots of human food had a really high body condition, and they had really high fecundity. So basically they were pretty fat and they were making lots of babies. And the jay density in campgrounds, so just how many jays there were in those campground areas, was 4 times higher than in surrounding like more natural forest areas without campgrounds and without those associated food subsidies. And the issue with that is that Steller's jays are also important nest predators of the marbled murrelet. And so high jay densities and fecundity was putting murrelets at even greater risk from Steller's jays spilling over from those campground areas where they're eating lots of food and into basically the only habitat that's left for murrelets. And so jay predation of murrelet nests is a pretty big deal. So population modeling work showed that reducing corvid predation might be the most effective way to recover the marbled murrelet populations in this area. And so I wanted to, we should have tested this before I tried it, Dylan, but I'm going to try to share a video really fast here. I think it'll work. Trigger warning, there is going to be some Steller's jays eating a marbled murrelet egg. So if you don't want to see that, cover your eyes for a minute here. Can y'all see this video? Oh no, sorry. Yeah, so this is the murrelet on the nest, and the Steller's jay is kind of starting to harass it. And basically was able to just harass it enough that it kind of fell off the nest. And here comes its buddy. There's a good chance this is a pair of Steller's jays. The one on the right has kind of bolder wing bars, so I'm kind of assuming that's the male and this is probably its mate. So yeah, a little bit of a bummer, but that's kind of the problem that we're dealing with here. So we saw that. So yeah, here's kind of the crux of the issue. We have all these jays here and they're eating tons of snacks, which is not ideal. But luckily, kind of in our wildlife ecology and wildlife management toolbox, we have a lot of strategies to deal with unwanted predators like this. And one of the main ones that we've used in the past is lethal management. So for example, we could shoot Steller's jays and remove them from parks. As you can imagine, there are a lot of ethical concerns that go along with this kind of strategy, and it can also meet with really extreme public backlash. And so the other factor to consider here is that Steller's jays are also native to the redwood ecosystem. So they belong here just as much as marbled murrelets do. They're a native predator. It's kind of just because of human actions that they've been able to take on this kind of problematic role that we have here. So maybe shooting them is not the best plan. Another strategy is selective removal of problematic individuals. So basically you capture Steller's jays that are known to eat a lot of human food and you move them somewhere else. This can be challenging for a number of reasons. First of all, it can be really hard to catch a jay, and I'm going to talk about this more in a minute, but it can be tough. And then the other really tough part is that Steller's jays are birds and they can fly, hopefully, obviously, to most of you. And so the same individuals might return to these campground areas, or if you remove this individual, other individuals might just come and colonize the same area. So potentially the maybe easier solution is just to try to reduce the amount of human food that's available to Steller's jays. Are y'all still able to see my screen okay?
Yeah, everything looks great, Kristin.
Okay, cool. I was like, I feel like I'm getting weird. Okay, that's probably just on my end. Okay, thank you, Dylan. So yeah, basically what California state parks decided to try to do to reduce this nest predation threat to marbled murrelets was try to reduce the amount of human food that's available. And so to do that in 2013, they started what they call the Crumb Clean Campaign, which aims to reduce human food subsidies to jays and a lot of other wildlife species as well. By using outreach to visitors, they improved their trash management a lot, and they really enforced these food policies. So rangers would go around, other park staff would go around and check campers especially and make sure that all of their food is put away. If food isn't put away to a satisfactory level, basically they can actually fine visitors and charge them money. So the policy has a little bit of teeth to it. And we basically wanted to know for my project whether this policy was working. And so we asked two main questions. First of all, can management efforts actually reduce the amount of human food that's being eaten by jays? And if so, how do jay populations respond to this reduction in a really previously abundant food resource? Because there's kind of a lot of ways that they might respond. And so to answer those questions, we studied jay populations within those campground areas at Big Basin. And we studied jays in two time periods. So the first was the pre-management period from 2010 to 2013. And that's kind of where that data was coming from that I was citing at the beginning, where we knew that jays were eating a lot of human food. We knew they were super fecund. We knew they were super fit. And so that's the pre-management period. And then management began kind of late 2013, and then in 2014 through 2016, we kind of just let the policy do its thing. And then I did my first field season in 2017. So the summers of 2017, 2018, and 2019, we were out here trying to figure out what effect the Crumb Clean campaign was having on these Steller's jay populations. And so we measured a lot of different aspects of jay populations to try to see what was going on. The first one was actually measuring the amount of human food that jays were eating. And to do this, we used what is called stable isotope analysis of feather samples. And the way that this works is basically the old adage, you are what you eat, is quite literally true. Human foods are often corn-based, so things like high fructose corn syrup. And corn is a C4 plant, so that's a photosynthetic pathway. So a lot of human foods are really enriched in this heavy isotope of carbon, while more natural food items for jays like insects and nuts and berries are less enriched in that heavy isotope because primary productivity, so all of the plants on the West Coast are usually C3 plants, so a totally different photosynthetic pathway. So that was a lot of sciencey mumbo jumbo to basically say that human foods are isotopically distinguishable from other natural food sources in Steller's jay feathers. So we were able to take a little clipping of a Steller's jay feather and then basically break that down and see what the isotopic concentrations were within that feather to kind of get a rough idea of what the jays were eating. We also collected feather samples and used feather growth bars as a proxy for body condition. And so a growth bar is a light and a dark band, so two bands that are visible on feathers, and those represent 24 hours of feather growth. So it's kind of like a tree growth ring, except it's on a bird's feather. And feather growth is really energetically costly. I've never done it myself, so I can't speak from experience, but I hear that it takes a lot of energy to grow a feather. And so healthier birds grow feathers faster and therefore have wider growth bars. So the main idea here is that wider growth bars equals better body condition. We also fit a subset of Steller's jays, mostly males, with radio transmitters, and then used relocations from tagged birds to understand how home range size, so how much space a bird uses to meet its nutritional needs, and home range overlap, so how much does a bird's home range overlap with its neighbors on average, changed between pre and post management periods. And then lastly, maybe most simply, we just wanted to understand how many jays there were and how many babies they were making, so density and fecundity. And to estimate these, we conducted point counts, which basically involves a standardized survey where you go out and count how many jays you see and hear, and you estimate how far from you they are. And then from there, you can estimate how many jays there are within the area that you effectively surveyed. And so we conducted those point count surveys both in campground areas, so in those areas with the food subsidies, and then also in unsubsidized forest areas, so that we could try to be sure that any changes we were seeing in jay density were actually due to management and not just kind of a broad change to jay population densities, regardless of the availability of all of these human foods. And then to estimate jay fecundity, we used what's called a juvenile to adult ratio, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's an estimate of how many juveniles are produced per adult. And it's basically kind of a snapshot of reproduction and all of the different demographic rates that go into it. So those were the metrics that we measured. And so you might have noticed that a lot of these metrics, like feather samples and everything else, require us to catch jays. So I wanted to take a minute just to talk about catching Steller's jays, because I feel like this is the part of the project that people usually ask me a lot about. And I will start by saying that there's a whole mountain of paperwork and a lot of thought involved in getting all of the proper permits and certifications to do this in a way that ensures bird safety and ethical research, which is a long-winded way of saying don't try this at home, don't just go catching birds. But yeah, as you can imagine, jays they're corvids, so they're in the same family as things like crows and ravens, so they're incredibly smart. And so catching them can be challenging. And I would say that catching them once is pretty easy. It's when you have to catch them a second time that it gets more challenging. So we had to catch them at the beginning of this season to deploy those radio tags that I talked about. But then we had to catch them again, the same individuals, at the end of the season to try to gather all of those samples to assess their diet and body condition and basically what they had been doing all season. And so to catch jays, we typically use mist nets, and these are really classic bird research, like bird catching 101 is to use a mist net. Ornithologists have been using these for hundreds of years. And so this is what a mist net looks like here on the left. You can see this pole that's close to us on this side, and then there's another pole back here. And then between those poles, it's kind of hard to see. You can see the loops on this net a little bit, but there is a really fine mesh net strung between these two poles. And we would usually set our mist nets in kind of an L shape. And so you can see the second pole here for the second net. And then we would normally use a Bluetooth speaker like this one on the right, and we would broadcast some jay calls so that territorial individuals would hear those calls and basically be like, who is in my territory? I'm gonna go beat them up. And then this is Lucky here. He was our jay decoy. I thought for like one hot second that sewn felt decoy would trick the jays into thinking there was another individual in their territory, but they were not fooled. They're way too smart for that. It didn't work. So yeah, Lucky became a little bit more of a team mascot than anything else, but he's cute and he lives in my office now. But yeah, so basically the jays would come in, they would hear the speaker, they would check out the area, and then every now and then they would just fly into the net on their own. And sometimes we would have to chase them into the net. There were a few times that the mist nets kind of stopped working, especially by the third field season when we were trying to catch some of the same individuals for the third season in a row. And so I did try modifying a laundry basket into like a caveman style trap. And this actually worked pretty well. And so you can see this jay here checking it out. And then there's a little pile of peanuts under the laundry basket here. And then our Bluetooth speaker, our trusty Bluetooth speaker. And then there's a little string under here and then, or sorry, a stick here and then a string tied to the stick. And then we were attached to the other end of the string to pull it when necessary. And this is a video, so I'm just going to kind of show you how this worked. Oops, maybe. So he's checking it out. He gets under there into the danger zone, and then that's me running to get the bird out of the trap. So yeah, we got a little desperate sometimes, but this actually worked super well. And it seemed like basically we just needed to kind of mix up what we were doing and show them something that they hadn't seen before in order to be able to catch them. So yeah, once we had a bird captured, we would very carefully extract it from the mist net or the laundry basket, as it were. And then we would really carefully work up each individual, gather the feather samples that we needed, and then we would also band each bird with a unique combination of colored plastic leg bands. There are better pictures of these, I think, coming up, but you can see those colored leg bands here in this bird that Lake is holding. And those colored leg bands help us tell who each bird is without having to recapture them. So basically we could recite them with binoculars from a distance without having to catch them every single time. And then this bird on the right, you can kind of see what it looked like when a bird was totally worked up and finished and about to be released. And so this bird was one of the special lucky ones that got a radio transmitter as well. So you can see the radio transmitter just a little bit right here. As soon as this bird preens, you wouldn't be able to see this at all. But you can usually see the little antenna hanging off the bird. So usually from a distance, we could spot our radio telemetry birds, which was nice. No birds were ever harmed during this process. Yeah, I was really lucky to work with great field technicians who learned really quickly. And yeah, we were able to work really safely with all of the Steller's jays. And so everyone was released after they were worked up. So yeah, with that, happy to answer any more questions about that when we get to the end here. But yeah, I think for now, let's dig into some results. So the first finding, and maybe this was the first thing that I found, and I was really excited about it when I got this result. Basically, it looked like management reduced the amount of human food that was being eaten by Steller's jays. So this figure shows those isotopic concentrations that I was talking about of the 3 diet sources that we found for Steller's jays. So anthropogenic food or human foods are on this axis here. And then invertebrates, so insects, were over here. And then mast, which is things like nuts and berries and seeds, basically plant material, is on this axis down here. And so each dot that's on this figure represents the isotopic concentration, the diet concentration from one individual jay. So you can see kind of pre-management, these dots are really kind of spread up here to the right towards this anthropogenic food area. While post-management, most of the jays were really shifted over into this invertebrate and mast area. I think maybe this figure shows it a little bit better. But yeah, so here are those 3 diet sources again. You can see anthropogenic food pre-management was a lot. Basically, pre-management, we found that about 88% of the jay diet was composed of human foods, which is a little bit horrifying. And then post-management, that had been reduced to about 47%. And then you can see mast and invertebrates changed quite a bit less over that same time period, but they were basically replacing all of those human foods with mast and insects. And there's a really good picture of those leg bands. This bird was white and metal on the right and then orange-white on the left here. And we called him Creamsicle. So how did this reduced human food consumption actually affect jay populations? Maybe a little bit surprisingly, in terms of body condition, we basically found that there wasn't much of an effect. Growth bars were approximately the same width pre and post management, as you can see from this figure. And the reason I say they're about the same, it looks like post management is higher, but there's actually a lot of overlap between these confidence intervals here. So we can't really say that there's any difference between those pre and post management periods. it was kind of a similar story for home range sizes. So we found that the amount of space that was used by jays pre and post management was pretty similar. But interestingly, there was a really big difference in how much their home ranges overlapped with each other. And so this figure shows just a little portion of the home ranges that we delineated. It's just kind of a handful of the ones that we were able to track. And so you can see pre-management, these home ranges almost completely overlap with each other. So jays were using a lot of the same spaces. And I think it's because they were packed so densely into this campground area. And then post-management, there's a lot less overlap between each of these home ranges. And so the overlap index went from 0.65 pre-management, so about 65%, to 0.1 post-management, so about 10% overlap on average. So that's a pretty big difference. And then maybe the most exciting finding from this work was just that there was a huge difference in campground densities after management. So direct your attention to this far left set of bars. So this is adult density of Steller's jays in those subsidized campground areas. And pre-management, there were about 4.33 jays per hectare, which is really high. And then post-management, we found this really dramatic decline to less than 1 jay per hectare. And in those unsubsidized areas, so those natural areas that were far removed from campgrounds, jay densities stayed basically the same, which is what you'd expect if management is the thing that's causing this big dramatic decline that we're seeing. And then the story with juvenile density was pretty similar. So the overall number of juveniles that was being produced annually declined really substantially. And then kind of interestingly, individual fecundity, which was measured by that ratio of juveniles to adults, actually stayed about the same after management. So if you think about it, this is a ratio. So if you remember how dramatically adult density declined, it means that the number of juveniles produced annually also declined dramatically. But the actual like per capita fecundity for each adult jay didn't really change. So there's fewer adult jays, fewer juvenile jays, but the actual fecundity of individuals is about the same. But if you just kind of do the rough math, in the pre-management period, there would have been about 139 juveniles produced annually, while in the post-management period, there only would have been about 30 produced annually. So that's a really, really strong decline in the number of jays being produced each year. So that was a lot of results, but just to kind of sum it up and put it all together, we had fewer jays that ate less human food in the post-management period, but the jays that did remain in campgrounds were still reaching a pretty high level of fitness. So they've still, on average, like per capita, are making quite a few babies, and they're able to maintain that pretty high body condition. And so here's kind of my graphical representation of what happened at the park. Excuse my poor graphics, but so pre-management, we have all this human food in the park and all of these Steller's jays that are here to take advantage of it. And then the Crumb Clean campaign comes in and is able to reduce some of those human foods. And therefore, a lot of the Steller's jays leave, resulting in really reduced density of Steller's jays. So what does this all mean? Basically, I think that management efforts that are aimed at changing human behavior, when we use them in tandem with things like food management and policy enforcement, can constitute a really useful conservation tool for reducing densities of subsidized species. And the good news is that the reduction of subsidies has really reduced jay densities in this campground area, which is really exciting. It's not a silver bullet, right? Jays were still eating a ton of human food subsidies. Even post-management, I think 47% of their diet was coming from human foods. And I don't know if it's realistic to ever expect that we can completely eliminate human food subsidies from these areas. But the amount that we've reduced jay densities might be a really big success for the marbled murrelet. Because we know that jays forage opportunistically from other research conducted by Jeffrey Black's lab at Humboldt State, We know that the way they forage is opportunistic and they don't really use a specialized search strategy to look for nests. It's kind of just if they happen to come across a nest, they will eat the eggs or the nestlings. And so lowering those jay densities likely reduces the probability that jays will come into contact with and predate murrelet nests. And it's not even just murrelets, right? There's lots of other songbird species living in these campgrounds that could be predated by Steller's jays. And then I think beyond even Steller's jays and marbled murrelets and the old growth redwood forests of the West Coast, this work has really broad applications. Human food subsidies are a global phenomenon, and they can affect basically every aspect of species ecology and human-wildlife interactions. The work that the next chapter that I'm working on right now is actually looking at how the human food subsidies in this area have changed the relationship between like social dominance in jays and fitness. So normally you would think that a dominant bird is super fit because of its dominance, but it looks like that relationship has actually been kind of decoupled for Steller's jays in this area. So stay tuned. I'm really excited to at some point in the near future share that work as well. But basically this work shows that visitor education in these protected areas, these areas that are essential for wildlife conservation and species protection, visitor education can be one piece of a broader strategy to make human recreation and conservation a little bit more compatible. And the exciting thing is that strategies like these could work in a lot of other systems as well to reduce some of the conflict between humans and wildlife and basically hopefully make the world a better place for both wildlife and humans.